way up. Way up. Way up. Way. On the gas and I'm smashing it. Hopping in my lane, I'm probably crashing it. Way up.
It's been a whole year now that I've been using the Canon EOS R6, and I think it's safe to say that I really love this camera. Today, let's talk about why I love this camera, and there are obviously a few things that I don't like about this camera. No camera is perfect, and so let's dive into it. First of all, I'd like to just get the things I don't like about this camera out of the way first. That way we can end off the video on a great note with all of the things I love about this camera. The very first thing that has come to my attention that just isn't super great about this camera is that when using the EF to RF adapter with older EF lenses, it isn't able to reach its maximum burst rate, which in the mechanical shutter, the maximum burst rate is 12 frames per second. This is for photos. And for the electronic shutter, it would be 20 frames per second. All lenses can reach 20 frames per second in the electronic shutter mode. But when it comes to the mechanical shutter, which is the shutter I use most of the time, I do have a video explaining the differences between mechanical and electronic shutters, but basically, if you want to avoid flickering lights, you don't want to use the electronic shutter. And having a good burst rate for sports is incredibly important, but the lens I use for sports, the 7200 f2.8L version 1 with image stabilization, is from 2001. It is still a great lens, and I do have a review of it. It is a little bit older, but essentially there's nothing wrong with the lens. It's just that for some reason, Canon doesn't support 12 frames per second with older EF lenses. Specifically, it reaches around, I believe, 9 or 10 frames per second instead of the full 12, which honestly isn't a deal breaker, but there is viewfinder blackout when you have that lower burst rate, and for me it is kind of annoying. Obviously, this problem would be fixed if I were just to buy an RF lens or one of the newer EF 7200s, and I'd probably lean towards getting the EF 7200 because I think the RF version is just ridiculously expensive, and I don't like externally zooming lenses. Anyways, that's a completely different topic. It's just kind of annoying in some circumstances, but as someone who does overshoot, sometimes it actually can be a blessing. But if you do want to get that full 12 frames per second, you're going to need to make sure that you have either the newest EF lenses or you have RF lenses. That's important. But I do feel like if the older EF lenses can get 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter, no problems, they should also be able to get 12 frames per second with mechanical. So I do believe that this is Canon purposefully crippling older lenses so that they make you go and buy new ones. It's annoying, but I'll deal with it. The next thing that bothers me about this camera is pertaining to video shooting, specifically regarding in-body image stabilization. And yes, it is the notorious IBIS warping at wide focal lengths. And this is not a camera-specific thing. Any camera that has in-body image stabilization will have some form of IBIS warping when you are on a wide lens. Specifically, my 17 to 35mm f2.8L, as soon as I get past 20mm going on the wide end, there is this absolutely horrible, it's disgusting. The wobble on the corners, it ruins shots. It literally ruins shots. And the only option to get rid of it is to turn off IBIS, but that is an annoying process. If I were to shoot on my 17 to 35 at 35mm, the IBIS works fantastic. It stabilizes the sensor, and that's really nice to have, especially if your lens doesn't have in-body image stabilization. But the only real way I see that Canon could possibly fix this is that they implement a feature where if you go past a certain focal length on the lens, you can program this in, going wider, it would automatically turn IBIS off. Or just have the ability to use one of the custom function buttons to turn off IBIS. Maybe you can do that. I have not found a way to do that, but I'm sure maybe if I look into the settings a bit more deeply, I could find it. But if anyone knows in the comment section if there's a way to do that, that'd be great. But the problem is, it's just really annoying for video, and I just have to keep that in mind whenever I'm filming handheld. It's only really with handheld. Sometimes with the gimbal, if you're doing some steps, it'll do like some wobble, but I typically don't use gimbals that often. So it's kind of out of the question for me for gimbals, but just be aware that the IBIS will cause problems if you're going on a wide lens. If you're doing photos, it doesn't really matter unless you're trying to like make like a boomerang kind of thing with like your like stop motion in a burst, you will see some wobbling, but for photos, it's really not a big deal. The IBIS works flawlessly. You get so much more stable images, but for video, anything past 20 millimeters, you're gonna have some problems. And that's just kind of how IBIS works. If you have a Sony camera, Panasonic camera, whatever you have that has IBIS, it's probably gonna do this on a wider lens, and that's just physics. But what isn't physics is software, and software can be used to turn off IBIS by just telling the camera to turn it off. And I think Canon should have the ability to program that to a custom function button or something like that, you know? Anyways, that's kind of really my problem with the IBIS. Everything else about the IBIS is just fantastic. The final thing that I just do not like very much about this camera is not deal-breaking long-term because it can technically be fixed in post. It's the fact that this camera has the absolute worst video codecs known to man. I am sorry, but if you actually enjoy editing H.264 or H.265 footage, I think you might need to seek professional help because H.265 is notoriously horribly slow for editing. The computer that's right next to me right now was purpose-built for video editing, and I pumped a lot of money into that computer so I could make it beefy and edit my footage. I have so much trouble, and it shouldn't be having this trouble, even though I have a RTX 3070 GPU in here that's supposed to assist with video decoding. It is an absolute nightmare to work with. I have to create proxies, optimize media, all these different things in DaVinci Resolve, render cache, just to make it work. Canon, any company, if you're putting H.265 codecs into your cameras, please stop. Please stop. Use ProRes or DNx HR. It's so much better. That's just a request, because you can convert it to these things in post, but having it in camera would be amazing. And yeah, I could get an external monitor, and I actually kind of do plan on doing that, which would allow me to record either ProRes or DNxHR, I think that's what it's called, externally. Basically, those codecs are going to be so much smoother for playing back because it doesn't compress the data as it records it. It leaves all the data, and the computer can just read it and not have to uncompress it as it goes. The video data rates on the R6 are already phenomenal, and there's tons of data in the files. You can do lots of great stuff in the editing, but when it comes to playback, it's a nightmare. Even if you could have like the beefiest system, H.265 will kill your processing. That's just how it works, and it's unfortunate that camera companies continue to do that in 2021. I think that Canon could also push all-I encoding instead of IPB encoding to this camera. It would make things slightly better. Even if they kept it in H.265, it would make things slightly better. But if you do have an external recorder and you use it with ProRes or DNxHR, it is all-I video, and that is actually really good. So if you have an external monitor like the Atomos Ninja 5 or the Blackmagic Video Assist 12G HDR 5-inch or 7-inch, I think those are what they're called, they can do all-I encoding, but you have to do it externally. One other problem actually does come with external recording. The R6 cannot record simultaneously to the camera's SD card and an external recorder at the same time. You have to choose one or the other, and that is really weird because the R5 and the original EOS R, a camera that's cheaper than this one, can record simultaneously to the SD card and the external recorder you're using if you're using an external recorder. That makes absolutely no sense. Canon needs to, fix that, because it doesn't make any sense to pay $2,500 for a camera and then pay another $600, maybe $700 on an external recorder so you have better video recording features and not have that backup. It's just kind of upsetting. Anyways, those are the only things I don't like about this camera, and obviously they are pretty annoying issues. It's not deal breaker because the good things definitely outweigh the bad things for me personally, and I do realize that for $2,500 this is probably the best camera for that price. Obviously the Panasonic S5 does great, but if you're shooting Canon and you do not want to use a different camera system and switch all of your lenses and it's a nightmare to do that. Shooting Canon, this is the best option for that price point. And could it be improved? Obviously, there's always room for an improvement. But now we're going to talk about the great things that this camera does, and this camera does it excellently, and that is what keeps me really loving to use this camera every single time I pick it up. And the first thing specifically being build quality. The build quality of this camera is just absolutely amazing. The second I pulled it out of the box, it felt like a tank in my hands. I used to think that my previous camera, the Canon T6i, felt really great in my hands, that it felt like a solid camera. I picked up the R6 and the T6i immediately felt like a toy. I was very surprised. Well, actually, I shouldn't have been surprised, because for the price, you better be getting good build quality. If you're going to pay that much, you need to have good build quality, and Canon absolutely does deliver. Ergonomically, the camera is perfect for me, and if you pair it with the battery grip, like I have it right now, it just is so good. It feels so solid in the hands, and it just is great. It's a tank. It's taken a beating. I do try to give it royalty treatment when I can. If you have been watching this channel for a while, you will know that I do go out in situations that probably aren't ideal for filming. Like, I've gone out in blizzards and filmed before. I've gone out in the rain and filmed before. This camera is weather sealed to a certain extent. There is no such thing as truly being waterproof. Weather sealed does not equal waterproof. And there is an instance where this camera almost broke because of that, because I pushed it too far. But if you're in a situation where it's snowing and you're getting some snow on the camera, or if it's raining lightly, if you take it out in downpour, you're gonna have a problem, as I'm about to mention. But if you're just in light rain, snow, you get a little splash on it, dust, this camera is fine. It'll take a beating, and it should work fine. Obviously, I am not responsible for any damage incurred to your camera if you choose to go out and shoot in the rain as the result of this video. Don't sue me, right? It's not gonna end well. It's not my fault. Canon does say that this camera is weather sealed, and therefore it can be used in the rain. Obviously, it's not ideal. You don't want to be keeping it out, getting it soaked. That's not good. Make sure you dry it off, or take good care of your camera, right? But it's good to know that you do have flexibility in situations like those. Now, let's get on to that situation where the weather sealing was pushed to the limits. There is a point where if water gets into any camera, and it can happen, if you're changing lenses, if you're opening the battery compartment, if you're doing anything, water can get in. And one time I was out filming in the pouring rain. I should not have been out in the pouring rain. That's too much for the camera, any camera really. Unless you have maybe a GoPro or something that's watertight and able to be going underwater, sure. But the R6, most mirrorless cameras and DSLRs cannot do that. But this situation, I was out filming in the rain for like a solid 30 minutes, and then the camera just started freezing up and spazzing out. Like, the autofocus was like going pulsing, the buttons weren't working. I was freaking out because I'm like, oh shoot, I pushed the limits too far and I broke my camera. Great. So I came back to my car and I waited for like an hour, just waiting, drying, and the camera dried out and it started working again. So thankfully the camera recovered, but there is a limit, so don't push it. So use common sense. Use common sense. That's important. Now let's talk about the actual images and videos that this camera produces. For photography, this camera is no slacker. People will complain that it's only 20 megapixels. For me personally, that is not a problem at all. It actually leads to quote-unquote better low light performance because of pixel density and all that kind of mathematical stuff that I'm not going to bore you with in this video. But 20 megapixels is more than enough for me. Technically, it was a downgrade from my previous camera, the T6i, which was 24 megapixels, but that was going from a crop sensor to a full frame sensor, which is a sensor size increase, so perceived resolution is actually probably better on this camera. I've not really had a problem. If you crop your images a lot, you might want to get the R5. Obviously, that's a lot more money, but if you want to crop, you gotta maybe get 45 megapixels. That's better a little bit for cropping. But if you're not going to crop too much, or if you're not going to crop at all, I personally try to avoid cropping unless my composition is just off, like by a lot. It's fine. 20 megapixels is great. I actually have prints downstairs from my dad's Canon 6D Mark I, which those are 19.9 megapixels, and it's massive. And the perceived resolution, it's great. So honestly, if you're worried about having quote-unquote low resolution, don't worry about it. 20 megapixels is fantastic. Obviously, if you want to crop or you want to have that, I don't know, like put on a billboard, maybe get the R5, but you don't stand right in front of a billboard and look at it and count the pixels. You stand away from the billboard, so it doesn't matter. Billboards are actually really low resolution. Anyways, that's besides the point. We're talking about an R6, not billboards. But yes, the photos I've taken on this camera are really beautiful, and obviously I've been doing a lot of photography expeditions and missions this year, and I've taken some of my favorite photos I've ever taken on this camera. It's just such a dream to use. The autofocus works flawlessly as long as you know what autofocus mode to use in what situation, like eye autofocus, center point with expand. I have a whole video actually explaining the autofocus points, and the great thing is you can use the autofocus points in video too. Like if you don't want to use the eye tracking, you can use like the center points, you can use the area points, you can use all these different things in both photo and video, and it works great. The autofocus, not really anything to complain about with this camera. Obviously, if you're using older lenses, it's usually the lens that will slow you down, not the camera. This lens I have on here right now is the EF 85mm f1.4L with image stabilization, and it is shooting at f1.4 right now, but the autofocus is really snappy. Obviously it's video. I have the autofocus speed set to be slower, so that way it's not pulsing back and forth and causing weird like focus breathing issues, because that is a problem. So I've slowed the autofocus speed for video, but for photo I have it set to the fastest it can be, and it is snappy, and it's great for sports, great for just any circumstance. You have great control over the autofocus, and if you know how to use it, you can get great shots. And if you do want to see lots of images from my R6, you can check my Instagram out, link in the description of this video or on my channel, and one of like the things you can click up on the top. It would be appreciated if you could give me a follow, or maybe even send me your own R6 pictures and share them with me on there if you have Instagram as well. I would love to see what you are creating with this camera. And yeah, it's a fantastic camera. I've used it for sports, photojournalism, portraits, just nature photography, landscape photography, environmental portraits, lots of different things. I love using this camera. It works so great for photos and really great for video as well. And now, obviously, let's talk about video. And since I got this camera, I've been doing a lot more video stuff because this camera has so much more video capabilities than my previous camera. My previous camera, like if I want to do slow motion on my T6i, I had to bump the resolution down to 720p, and it was only 60 frames per second. This camera, the video, I've been using it for a year. It's so good. Like, you're looking at it right now. You're looking at the beautiful video that this camera produces, and it is absolutely fantastic. Full frame 4K at up to 60 frames per second with a massive data rate. Obviously, I mentioned earlier the codecs are annoying to work with in post, but if you create optimized media in DaVinci Resolve or shoot in ProRes with an external monitor, or just maybe beef up your computer to like the maximum you can, you're gonna get beautiful videos, and it's excellent for color grading. I have access to C-Log and C-Log 3. C-Log 3 is the better of the two. It doesn't have C-Log 2, which is the best, but that's reserved for cinema cameras. But the great thing is you get 10-bit video, 4K at up to 60 frames per second. Beautiful, and it's great for color grading. I have been able to create so many beautiful looks with this camera. You can call it cinematic, whatever you want to call it. Cinematic is, that word is misused so much, but really, it's just so awesome to use this camera for video. Specifically, I do actually use the crop mode for video, and people complain about the EOS R for having cropped 4K video, but on here I have the option to do full frame video or cropped video. If I'm using a 17 to 35mm lens and I'm too lazy to switch to like a 50mm lens if I want to get a tighter shot, I just turn on the crop mode, set the lens is 35mm, and boom, I'm at like 50. I'm not doing the math in my head right now. I don't feel like it, but it crops in, and it's native 4K. It's when you're at the full frame 4K, it's oversampled from 5.9K, which is really sharp. It looks sharp, it looks great, and then when you crop in, it's the native 4K. So you're still getting a sharp 4K image either way you go, and I think that's really great. Furthermore, let's go into more depth about C-Log 3. I mentioned it like a few seconds ago, but C-Log 3 is really making my videos look so much better. Like, let's go before, after, much better. But C-Log 3, the flat color profile, I do have a color grading tutorial for that. You have the ability to take that log profile and produce almost any look you want. Obviously, like, I'm not gonna try to shift colors around with this red rim light behind me and all that stuff. I do a very clean look for these kinds of shots. But really, C-Log 3 works excellently, and on this camera you get great dynamic range. It's not the best dynamic range. Obviously, this is not a cinema camera in terms of its dynamic range, but for me, dynamic range usually is not an issue. I actually kind of like glowing highlights. Like, you're probably looking at the side of my face right now. It's probably a little bit overexposed, but I use the glow effect in DaVinci Resolve. I do have a tutorial for that as well. I have tutorials for a lot of things. Shameless plug, subscribe if you want to see more. And the glow effect, I have so much control over the image. Basically, C-Log 3 gives me so much control, and I think that's really awesome. And it has allowed me to learn so much about color grading. If you want to learn more about color grading, getting a camera that has the ability to shoot in some form of log in 10-bit color will really allow you to learn more and more color grading techniques. And over the past year, I have developed my own kind of visual style, done film emulation, done tons of different looks for commercial, personal, and YouTube, and filming, all this great stuff. C-Log 3 unlocks so much capabilities for you, even if it's just C-Log 1. Because I used to shoot in C-Log 1, it was great. C-Log 3, even better. Also, this camera does have 120 frames per second in 1080p, which is really really cool. Obviously, the R5 does shoot 4K 120 frames per second, but it's not real 4K, it's pixel bin. This is not native 1080p either, it's pixel bin, but the difference between 1080p and 4K both being pixel bin, it's not going to be too much sharper. You're not going to notice much of the difference. Having the ability to do 120 frames per second in 1080p is great. My old camera, the T6i, it's been a whole year since that was my main camera. And that thing, if, like I said, I had to push it to 720p instead of 1080p if I wanted to get 60 frames per second. Now I can do 120 frames per second in 1080p, and I can do 60 frames per second in 4K. It is exactly what I asked for. Obviously, there's always room for improvement. I would love to see AI encoding and better codecs within this camera, and even RAW externally, even if it's externally. I would love to see like RAW video, like ProRes RAW, and I'm sure that's great, but I would really like to see Blackmagic RAW coming out of this camera. Panasonic did it with the S1 and S1H. You can get Blackmagic RAW. As someone who uses DaVinci Resolve and loves the color grading workflow of Blackmagic Design's products, Blackmagic RAW would play back super smoothly in here, smoother than H.265 footage. Literal 12-bit RAW. And if you can't tell, I really do not like H.265. Anyways, there's always room for improvement. But for the price, it is hard to complain about the features in the R6. And you can always upgrade it with an external recorder. I'm looking into getting an external recorder in the future. Yada, yada, yada. Lots of jargon that you don't really care about. But the R6 is no slacker when it comes to video. People are like, oh, the R6 is bad. It overheats. It doesn't overheat. I've never had it overheat. And right now, I've been shooting for like 20 minutes so far. And I do not see the overheating timer. None of that. Obviously, there is the 30-minute recording limit. Personally, for me, that's never been a problem because I don't record for 30 minutes, although this is cutting it close. I'm going to have to cut this video down a lot, obviously, in post, but the 30-minute thing doesn't bother me. If you like to record long events, 30-minute thing, get an external recorder, you don't have the limit anymore. That's my review on the video side of things, and if you want to see more of my video footage, I have short film shot on this camera. I'm actually working on another short film right now. Do be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more, and with notifications on as well. Maybe even dropping a like on this video would be really appreciated. And I have pretty much all of my literally all my videos since literally a year ago have been shot on the R6, unless it's the drone shot, because I don't mount the R6 to a drone. That's kind of scary. But yeah, the R6, I've been using it for a year. I would highly recommend it. And by the time this video goes up, the Sony a7 IV has probably been announced. It hasn't been announced as the time I'm recording it, but Sony does have a release date for, I think, tomorrow or the next day. And even still, I'd still get the R6, because I saw the leak specs for the Sony a7 IV. Sure, it's great, but I have the R6. I love the R6. I love Canon, even though they cripple some of their cameras every now and then. I still love Canon. I'm sticking with Canon. But yeah, anyways, that is the video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope it was helpful. If you have an R6 or whatever camera you use, let me know down in the comments. I'm interested in hearing what you guys all use. And if you enjoyed the video, obviously, it would be much appreciated if you drop a like and subscribe with notifications on. Thank you for watching, especially to the end. I'm Rocco, and I will see you in the next video. Peace. I guess I gotta...